Hello there, Reason users. PoohBear here, and welcome to my channel. And today I'm going to be looking at how I do my radio buttons because a request has come in, and by radio buttons, I'm actually using my controller. And as you can see, I'm actually changing the buttons, but I don't have to deselect one to select another one. So obviously, if I use my mouse, we can do the same with the mouse as well. And this is what we're going to look at today. I'm actually going to be configuring it up just using my basic tablet. So I'm just using some basically, I converted my tablet so I can actually send out MIDI. And that's what I'm picking up inside of Reason. And if you want to see how I actually set that tablet up, or the communication side of it, in my video I released the other day, which was called obviously PoohBear's Looper with automatic MIDI alt takes, there's a section in the middle which literally takes you through everything of where the files are meant to be, what you need to do, and everything else to actually get it actually up and running within Reason. So I did actually go through this video once, recording it absolutely live with everything I was actually programming, and I'm going to admit it got a little bit messy because obviously I was programming and trying to talk at the same time and trying to do all the logic, and it just got a little bit confusing, or I think I end up confusing people more. So basically, at the end of that loop video, this is roughly how it looks. I think I only done 8 buttons. I hear it does say 12, or actually that one's down to 8. So at the end of the day, your remote INI contains your items and your inputs, and items always appear at the top. It's actually a bit backwards because if anything, you should talk about the inputs first for the items, but the items are very important because the input is obviously the MIDI controller itself, and these are the CC numbers that when I hit the button on my tablet, they're going to be sending out, and that's what we pick them up, and then we map them across this thing called button 1. This could be called Fred, but if it's called Fred here, the important thing at the top here is we'll have to call it Fred here as well. But being a button, it just makes it sense, or a knob 1, or whatever you're doing, just easier to follow. And then we make an item called button 1. Items are really, really important because then in your mapping file, let's go across to a mapping file, you have something like button 1, and this happens to be a combinator to equal button 1. Oh, really horrible. There we go. So we've got button 9 there equal toggle 1 down here. So that's something else different going on here. And that's how you relate it. So if I called it Fred, I'd have said map Fred to button 1. If it was a knob and I called it Tom, it'd be map Tom to rotary 1, being a combinator. So that's how that's how it sort of works together. Now, I've actually said I've reprogrammed it, and I've done it slightly different in here because what we're doing, because what you're actually looking at there, I suppose, in here is what we refer to as the automatic way. So Reason's automatically going to be picking these things up for us, and it's going to map them to these buttons, and then these buttons in the background, obviously via the remote map, and then map to a particular control. Because we want to do radio buttons, we've got to take, doing radio buttons is quite straightforward because it's a simple case of saying, hey, I've hit this button, fine, I'm going to turn that button on. I've got to make sure all the other buttons, if they're on, they must be switched off. Using the automatic way, there's absolutely no way of doing it, so we're going to have to do it manually. And the big advantage of manually is I could say I'm going to hit one button and I could change 50 controls if I wanted to. Oh, I'm hitting things. I could change 50 controls if I really wanted to. Then that's the advantage of doing manual stuff. And also with manual, we can sort of set this button to do several different things depending on the mode they actually are in. So I'm going to switch back to the actual code I'm actually running at the moment so you can actually see what's going on. In this particular script, I'll admit at the very, very top, a lot of all this stuff is to do with my login. So this is my login down here. And that's what I pump stuff out. I think that's a reverse. So I like to reverse tables, which I'll talk about in a minute because it makes it easier for lookup. But most of this other stuff is how to do with my login. Or I've got some very, very basic sort of functions I use. Yeah, there's a few key things. Again, who am I? That's for my login. Login's login. MIDI stuff, log. MIDI stuff to do is stuff we have to, I log into a table to send back around, which we'll talk about in a minute again. And there's a few other things like I track the max items. So what's quite important in the remote INI section here, he's saying, here we go, is we have to track these items. That would be button 1, button 2. So if you notice, I don't have all that long string. I've actually just got a very, very tight loop. And every time I go around that loop, I'm actually taking its index or its item index number, and I store it because we need to know that number later on for when we're manipulating the data. So when we assign this knob to, let's say, a frequency control or something, that frequency control information is going inside it's like an items table. It's not this items table, a remote items table, let's call it that, which we can manipulate using certain functions, or we can get that data out to say what value are you, and then we can obviously do things, but we have to reference it using the item index. I've got some paging going on, which I'm going to talk about, and for what we're actually doing today, getting your head around the paging is probably quite key, because it allows me to double up. And what I mean by doubling up, because at the moment I'm hitting my controller, as you can see, we've got ourselves some radio buttons. I'm coming down here with my mouse and we've got radio buttons, but I've set it up in such a way that if I now go into this mode, my mouse is now selecting all the buttons, but my buttons actually on the controller are still working in radio mode. Or I can go into this mode, and now I'm hitting my MIDI controller now, and as you can see with my tablet, should I say, they're now working as regular buttons. So we can actually double the buttons, our mouse, as either radio buttons or normal buttons, which makes perfect sense, because then we don't really have to touch the mapping files. They will actually should work the way you want, especially with something like a combinator. They work perfectly for this sort of scenario. I am tracking the inputs, but the inputs we could actually delete. We don't actually need them, because we're going to actually capture all the data in ourselves. The only other big thing I suppose I run here is I've got this control table. So this control table, in another mapping, I'll have buttons, I'll have faders, I'll have knobs, and I'll have other things like the transport. So there's quite a lot of stuff going on. But the key stuff is the CC number I happen to be sending in. With my Akai, it happens to be note on, note off information, which I have to track, and the item index. I know it says nil at the moment, but as soon as we run that remote ini, we get these populated up, because later on I'm going to be sending I'm going to hit a button on my controller. It's going to be coming in saying, hey, I'm CC11 or hex 0B. I need to say fine. What am I actually mapped to? What am I actually looking at in Reason? And I can say, oh, here's my item index. And I can say fine. Can I now go and get the value? I can get a value, and then obviously we can work on that. And that's really what we're doing. So that's quite an important table. And obviously I have this simple little map table to do with my pages, which I haven't spoken about totally, but the paging is allowing me to say, is it normal radio, but are they normal buttons, or are they radio buttons, or are they mouse normal buttons and radio buttons on the controller? So we can really mix it up if you want. If you wanted just radio buttons on the controller, we only have to do this next section. And in fact, you can remove some of this next section as well, because there's a bit of logic to work out, hey, which sort of mode am I in? So the remote process MIDI, that's for when I actually hit a note, or say I hit something on my controller, it's going to come in here as what we call an event. There happens to be this nice little function we can call, which is called a remote match map, which actually goes and manipulates the bits for us. So from there, it's taken like the YY would be the actual CC number, and the ZZ would be the actual value. And then later on, we can actually pump these into better names rather than say match.y, match.z. I can say, well, here's my CC num and here's my CC value. So it's easier to track. So in here, to start with, this is not needed, but you can see straight away, I'm looking at the CC value. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So the first thing you got to know about is your actual buttons. So with most controllers, when you hit button and you press it down, it's going to send out a 1. When you let go of the button, it sends out a 0. That's how they work. So we're only interested when it's being pressed down, and we're not interested when it's being released in this case. With certain other functions, you may want that. You may want that kind of what we refer to as a momentary style thing. So when it's down, we're in one mode, and when I release it, we go back into another mode. So you would have to track that. But I'm only interested if it's definitely on. And again, if you've got, say, a button where it's when you push it, it pushes 1, and then you release it, it sends nothing out, and you push it, it then sends out a 0. That's called a toggle button. Then again, you'll have to track it. But mine and most controllers are box standard buttons. 1, we're sending something out. When I release the button, it sends out a 0. So we're only interested in anything above 0. Now here, I've got these two little 54s and 53s, which weren't even referenced up at the top, and they happen to be on my controller. The way I've numbered my CC numbers is, so 53, R5, C3, and this is R5, C4, and I accidentally press RC, C3, which has actually just done an error. So I'm just going to pull this across here so you can sort of see what I'm talking about. He says, did I grab it? No. Oh, I've got to click on OK. Sorry. It's pulled this across and it's actually made my controller error out for the simple reason is I can output loads and loads and loads of output data. So you can do it that way, but I will tend to log everything down to this screen to save me having to go and copy this to clipboard and then look at it, then come back here and say, oh, I've got to stop and start my tablet. So if I was to hit that other button, my 54 button in this case, you can see this screen is really, really updated down here with loads and loads and loads of information about, say, what D page are we on? Or these are global pages, what I refer to as global pages, which I'll talk about. But here's the actual buttons from the combinator themselves. And because we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 set, so if we come up to button 4, we can see it's enabled. We can see the value says 1. The same as this one here. They're all going to say 1 because obviously they're all highlighted. But this is the information we can actually extract out and work out if we need to turn things on and off. Quite straightforward. So here comes my first probably confusing thing. As I say, I've been working on something I call global pages, which is actually in the mapping file. And I'm switching that using the keyboard shortcut variation. So that's a real nice way you can say, no, we're going to have normal buttons. And I can control that up here in the reason document. So if I do, I'm on Windows, so if I do a Control Alt 1, which would be your Option Command 1, I think, on the Mac, I can point myself at page 1. I don't have to point these at page 1. This is going to be a little bit confusing because keyboard shortcut variations are global. So if you've got multiple controllers and they happen to use this function, you'll be changing your shortcut variation on everything, including this one down here. So this is not really good practice because this mapping could get confused, or you might be saying, not realizing, I'm now on page 2, but page 2 is now working as radio buttons where they should be working as something totally different down here. So this is a throwback, this particular Hamoud thing, because I was obviously playing around probably when I was doing my looper program, to be perfectly honest. Yeah, well, I was. So that's what I was programming it up for. So I wouldn't recommend doing them twice. So ignore this bottom one, put it into the documents. And so I say this is now working as normal buttons. And then when I'm in this different mode, which I'm looking at here, so I'm saying when my global page isn't 1, then I'm going to run this extra bit of code. And this extra bit of code is only literally this long, and this is what's doing the radio buttons. With that control table as well, just to let you know, I do a reverse lookup. So I actually make sure that my CC numbers are kind of like the key. And then that way the value is the item number. Or in fact, I actually do it so I pull out all the data, but basically it allows me to do a simple statement like this by saying, well, here's my CC number. Does it actually exist? Because that could be a CC number for a knob. So if that's a CC number for a knob, it's going to not find it in this particular case and then just drop out. That's what we want. In fact, I've actually done a double check here to say, well, if it's a knob, maybe is the input type a button, because that's what we're interested in. And that item there on its own without anything else is just going to say, well, did we set anything? Because if we didn't set anything, that would be null. And it'll say if that's null, we just drop out. So it doesn't even bother doing the and. Next bit, I just send some information out to the screen because I'm just obviously experimenting and we can see what's going on. But this is the first important thing. We go and get that index item. So I've hit this button. I go and get that item and I'm going to say, is it equal to 1? Is it on? In this particular case, it would be on and go, okay, I'm already on. If I'm on, I don't want to turn myself on because here's a confusing thing with buttons in sort of the mapping world and reason. You need a 1 to turn this button on. You need a 1 to turn this button off. If we decided to make that button a value, so I'm going to get a bit confuse you, at the top we can say the types of value, well, you need virtually anything above 64 to turn this button on, and anything below it will actually turn it off. So it'd be like a 0 to turn it off, and then a 127 to turn it on. It turns it more into an absolute sort of mode, which can be nice to work with. But when you get your head round, yeah, you've got to remember there's a 1 for an on and a 1 for an off. You just got to manage it slightly differently, and that's what I'm doing here. So my value is great, is actually equal to 1. When I come into here, it's saying that button's already on. I'm going to set this CC value to 0. That's absolutely fine. We come down here. Now we're going to loop around all the rest of the buttons, and I'm going to exclude the button I've pressed. So I'm going to loop around, and if I happen to equal this button, I say fine. I'm going to just jump round, ignore it. When I do find a button, which matches. Again, I go and get obviously the control index. I go and look at it and say, is it greater than 0? So is this already on? If it is on and it's enabled, because we've got loads of other buttons. Obviously, we can have up to 32 buttons within the combinator. So buttons 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on and so forth. They're all not enabled, which actually here in my log window, you can actually see something similar. So button 12 doesn't exist, so it's not enabled. But if I put button 12 on here, it will become enabled. There is a gotcha, actually. If you're live adding buttons, so if I go into my edit mode and I add an extra button, I actually have to move away from the combinator, just highlight another device, then come back to it, and the remote sort of index files will actually update. If not, if I added 12 buttons, this would still say false. But if I then switched away and switched back, this will come back true. If I restart Reason, this will come back true. There's obviously a slight bug of not actually updating the information. But hey, where am I? Let's not get confused from at the top here. So I'm saying, yeah, it's greater than 0 because we've got it turned on and it is enabled. Cool. So we're going to send a 1 to it, and a 1 to it's going to turn that off. Brilliant. And it'll do it for the rest of these buttons. So it'll just turn all 3 of these buttons off. Then it'll come down this loop and it's going to say, is my CC value greater than 0? Which originally it was, but we've set it to a 0. No, it's not. So it's going to forget that next bit because we're already turned on. If this button was off and I turned it on, obviously when I get here, that would equal a 0. So my CC value would still equal 1, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously in here, I could say CC value equal 1. The reason I always do greater than, because I may change my mind and change that button into a value. So now I would look at absolute values of 0 and hopefully 127, and not anything between 1 and 63, because that will start confusing things. As I said, absolutes below 64 will turn things off, and above 64 will turn things on. We're dealing with buttons, we're dealing with ones and ones. And that is literally it in a nutshell. That is it working. If we go down into what's called the remote set state, this is the bit really, when I use my mouse, we'll turn it on and off as well. We trick a bit, and this is the trick. So with the remote set state, it's actually called several times a second, and if Reason's really busy, it's called it's called a little bit less. So it's not like a regular function, which is called exactly on time. It's kind of designed to update your controller in the background, because I've obviously clicked this button here. So, hey, let's go and turn that light on your controller. So turning that light on your controller is not a priority. Priority would be, hey, let's get our audio ready. Let's do this. So obviously Reason will prioritize things, and putting the light on your controller on is a low priority. Absolutely. Audio has to come first. We're in the door. Now, when you switch from one device to another, if you've got loads of items, it will send out loads and loads. It'll send out every single thing it knows about it wants to change. So we've got this item change table, so we can say, hey, is it got more than one value in it? If it hasn't, because don't forget this is called several times a second, we can just ignore it. I'm looking for when I've just changed one item. So if I've switched from one device to another device, as I say, it's going to come in loads of stuff. You can handle this totally different. I just done this for quickness, and this is a nice, simple way of working it, because it means this will only be called when I've pressed that button myself, rather than switching. So that's what that's looking at. So when I press the button, well, actually, when I press one control, it will come into here, and then it's going to say to me, well, what global page am I on? I've decided to say, well, if global page 3 selected, then my mouse will be a radio button. If global page 2 selected, it's going to be normal buttons, and page 1 will be normal buttons, same with page 4. So I've just done that dirty. And then again, it will go and say, this time I've got a reversed table, which has got the item index as the keys. And obviously then we've got the CC numbers of the values. So it does that quick lookup. So it's doing that same kind of dirty lookup. And if it doesn't find it, then this would be null. And again, if I say that's null, it's just going to drop out. Then we go and check it and say, is it the button we've actually pressed? Cool. Yes, it's a button. Probably should have in here maybe, well, it has to be enabled, I think, because we're here actually pressing it. We can't press button 12, because it's not there, it's not visible. So yeah, so we'd have to recheck if it's enabled or not. And if it is, this particular case, if it's greater than 1, here's a big difference. In the MIDI world, we've pressed the button, we come in, we check the status, the current status of the button. In the remote set state, we've come in, the button is already set, we've already pressed it. It's now then saying, right, this is the actual current value after I've actually pressed it or taken it off. So it's going to look at that and say, well, am I actually greater than 0? So I must be 1 or above. And if I am, because I have pressed it, I then go and shove it into this MIDI stuff to do table, and I make obviously the actual string of my CC number. I happen to talk back on channel 15. This has just been one of my silly little rules that when I do a loop back from inside my code, I look for channel 15. At the moment, at the top, I've got a question mark, so I'm looking for anything. It's good practice in a way because you can then make sure you don't set yourself up some kind of MIDI feedback loops if you actually are specifying channels and all the rest of it. And then I fire that out. And there's another way of delivering this MIDI out. And that will then act as a controller coming into the remote process MIDI. And then from that, it will actually run this routine again. So it's like me pressing the button on my controller, even though I've used a mouse, and it's going to come in and go, well, you've already selected it. That's fine. We can ignore that, but we can turn all the other buttons off if they were on. And that's how we actually do it. The reason we have to do it this way with a loopback is because this particular function here called remote.handle input can only run inside the remote process MIDI. That's the only place this function can run is inside here. So the way I get around it is I say, fine, I'm going to send this out, pretend to be a controller with a loopback and come back in again. This is actually doing the delivery. It's not much to it. It's a very simple routine. We basically have to populate a table that will return from this particular function, which is called, then reason will work on top of that. So as I say, I have my working tables, which I then stuff into the table, which is actually going to go out. I also use the ports. This is by not standard. Most people won't have anything in here at all. And the reason I have ports is because on my controller, what I've actually set up, which was slightly different from my MIDI loop thingy bobby. Oh, that's just reminded me of something else to talk about actually. And I will talk about it now because if not, I'm going to forget about it. I've actually got myself, I do my login separately. So you can see I've got this tablet. Sorry, it's small. I will zoom in. That says tablet because that's my output port. That's my tablet for my input port. And so that's kind of my loopback going. I'm going to talk about this now, even though it's sort of breaking off a bit because I know I'm going to forget. And it's an easy one to do. If, like I did originally, I created this tablet, I only had my input. My tablet was only coming in because it was just doing some stuff on that loop MIDI video. I didn't need to have any of these set. If these are not set, then your remote items table, what we're talking about, so where we go and have to look up this stuff to say is the value set, these aren't going to be set. They're not set. They're totally blank. You've got to have a MIDI port out for it to work. Also, it doesn't show it up here. Here, you can see on this one here, you have to have the output set. If you remove this word output at the end, again, this table here is not populated, so you can't go and get any information out of it. So you've got to have a MIDI output. You've got to have the output set. It's something simple, which is easy to fall into. And I'll admit, I've done it myself, especially, well, actually, I didn't do it this because I set my login up. Because I set my login up, I don't fall into the output port trap anymore, but I have done. I know I've done it. Because I've made myself pull my hair out and I've gone, oh, sod it, I'm going to go and set login up, and then it works. And you're like, oh, yeah, of course, I needed an output port. So I've done it myself. It's an easy one to do, but I thought I'd point them out. So let's try and go back to exactly where I was because I can't remember where I was. I was down here and I was talking about my delivery stuff. Yes, I was doing my delivery stuff. Now, I do my delivery stuff a little bit weird because obviously I'm doing this table insert into here and then I'm removing it, and there's no reason why I couldn't just shove that table straight into there. And the reason I ended up doing it this way round, and I've stuck with it, was right at the very, very beginning. I wasn't too sure if there was any kind of multi-threading going on at all. Am I getting some messages coming in on one of them other functions whilst I'm in the middle of delivery? And I thought, just in case I was, this is a nice kind of a simple way of handling that multi-threaded, because obviously I could say here, right, I'm going to take this and push this in here. And then rather than me then saying, I'm going to clear the table, because something in another routine, I didn't know, it doesn't do it, but it could have populated it. And then I could have said, let's clear the table. And I haven't actually sent the table out. That's how that's how you have to be careful about multi-threaded stuff. Because you might be saying, I'm going to clear this, but this routine is about to put something in, which you haven't processed. So this would have handled that if it would have happened. So I've left it like that because I've sort of done it across a lot of my Lua files. And so, yeah, I know it's a little bit backwards. I know why I've done it and I know why I don't need it, but I'm happy with the way that works. And I have just a simple little, you don't even need this bit down here to release. I only have this so it outputs to my log that when I actually turn my controller off, he says, I'm just going to go and turn my controller off. At the end, it just shows me it's closing down. So when I start it up, it tells me it's starting up. It tells me it's the tablet. Gives me that warm feeling that things are working the way they should be. So hopefully this has been big enough for everyone to see. Maybe I should have actually zoomed in a lot more. Trying to get everything on the screen is always a bit of a pain. So I've talked about the mapping file, haven't I? And I've talked about that. That's how I get my G pages. So by having a simple thing like this, so I'm just saying my shortcut variations equal page 1, shortcut variation page 2. This will actually set this to a 1. If I go to page 2, then this sets this to a 1, and it automatically sets these to a 0. A bit like a radio button. It does that for me in the background. So that's why I can just sort of look at one of these and say, is this a 1 or a 0? And not worry about if I'm setting things what I'm setting is this. It's managing it for me, which is really, really nice. That's quite straightforward. And I think the way, as I say, this is really the key bit, and it's quite basic logic. Are we turned on? If we're turned on, we're not going to do anything. If we're not turned on, then we will actually turn myself on, because don't forget we're doing this manually. And hit same here. It's just a simple looping around my button to say, well, if I need to turn it off, we need to turn it off. As I say, I think doing the global pages is really, really a real nice sort of functionality, because obviously I can use these as normal buttons. So I'm just hitting my MIDI controller and I've got myself some normal buttons going, and then I can obviously turn things on. And in fact, I'm going to turn them both on. Oh, there you go. I didn't turn them on, because I have to make sure reason is highlighted. Then I can do my keyboard shortcuts and it works. And you can see things working here. Now, let's confuse things. And this is nothing to do really with the radio buttons. This is more to do with now. Let's talk about this. The way things are working inside of Reason. You may notice I've got things like after change is wrong. So if we come along here and we do this, what's called this handle input. So this handle input is updating that table, what we're going to read. So this is actually going to update this table. However, if you read this table after you've done this update, it's still showing the old value. So things are not done in real time. I suppose that's the bottom line of it. So I could send this out and set this to a 1. If I read it back, it's still going to say it's a 0. So obviously I've hit something. It has set it to a 1. I've read the information back and it's saying it's a 0. So obviously in the background, Reason's going to do something. Then it's going to come along. Then it's going to say I'm going to do an update. And then once it's actually done its update, so you could say this remote.handle input is a request for update. I suppose that's the best terminology. I'm requesting that this is going to be updated to a 1, and we hope that's going to be honoured. And then obviously this would say 1 the second time I call this routine. So with another MIDI note coming in, it should all be updated. I've never come across it where if I call this routine twice in a row, that this item's then not updated. But yeah, but in this code, so right, even you've got loads of codes you've got to run later on, it still show the wrong value. So you need to bear that in mind. Other little things to kind of bear in mind is if I was to use my mouse, obviously, here's our remote set state, which we've come into. So the current value was already a 1, as I said, because I pressed it. It's a 1 before it hits that remote set state, which is fine. I actually, within there, rather than sending out a 1, I send out a 2, because I only need a 0 or really, and above 0 is going to turn something on. So I do set out a 2. I haven't done anything with it coming into here, but it does allow me later on, when things start to get complex, I know that if I've got a value 2, that is actually come from the set remote state and not from my MIDI controller. Yeah, because this will look like a MIDI controller input. But I know for a fact, A, it's on channel 15 if I really examined it, and B, it's set value 2. I know it's definitely come from a mouse functionality. So we actually go and make that change. So it's done its call. And because we've actually made a change, it's actually also updated the remote set state again. So so this is quite confusing how it decides it's actually going to come along. It's changed that one on, so it knows about it. We go in, say, fine, we're going to set it. And then we go in, set the other one off, because obviously our routine here is saying we've got to turn this light off, which is fine. And then our set remote set says, oh, I've been turned off. I've got to obviously go and tell this function that we've turned off, just in case you want to go and tell your MIDI controller that you've turned it off. But we've pretended to be a MIDI controller in between these. So yeah, so there is that kind of confusing loop going on. And really that kind of loop should also happen when I'm actually hitting my controller. And you might say, well, I'm actually hitting my controller, just my controller now. And you might be saying, well, why aren't you seeing set remote state in here? You are. It is actually running, and I can actually obviously easily put a thing in here to show it's running. The difference being is, because I'm using my MIDI controller to switch this, I've actually switched 2, not just 1. I've actually switched 2 functions here. And so this item changes will equal 2. So I could say, what you've got to be careful of if you're saying you're going to try and capture everything. When I done my Akai stuff, so that had radio buttons, I had a lot of stuff going on it. I was capturing a lot more, and I was, you don't have to be, but I was being clever by saying, well, if I come into this routine and I found a button on, I've got to go and turn everything else off, which is then going to loop round and call itself. So I had extra little flags set to say, well, if I processed it once, I've now processed it. So the rest of these item changes, because don't forget, I could say I've switched devices, so this would be called 50 times. It would say, actually, I've already been processed. You can jump me, you can ignore me. And then when it goes around the other loop, you can say, no, you can ignore me. So you have to kind of manage these things because you have got these 2 loops going. And so this is being called. We just can't see it because I'm only looking at when it's just one item only. It'd be okay if I do say if it's greater than 0, but obviously if it's greater than 0, well, actually, when the first time call it, it's just going to call it 50 times. Shall we just do that? We can just do that. We can just do that very, very quickly. Let's do this nice, quick and dirty. I'm going to do a save on that. I'm just going to go over and restart the surface here. So it's going to stop and start this. Bosh, he says. Oh, sorry. That should be 0, shouldn't it? That's my bad. This is the problem about doing things on the fly. Here we go. Let's restart that. I was expecting to see a lot more information come up here. So let me make sure reason is selected. If I click on the right screen and then do a Control-3, so they should all be selected now. So now as you can see, I actually did use my button. And let's make sure what we're on. We're on 13. So let me just change this once more. So there's 13 up the top there. So this is the line we came in where we set the new value. Fine. It's gone and done it. And then it's now jumped in to do its actual routine. So this one will actually have the items will be set to 2. So before you wasn't seeing this come up because it was only set to, because we was only looking for one item when we actually use our mouse to press things. So when we use our mouse, we're on 16, he says. You can see we're jumping backwards and forwards through the loops. Just be aware that is something which might happen. And if I do something silly like go into that mode, and so I'm going to turn these 3 on, and then I'm going to hit that button there. I should really do the count so you can see what the actual change item count is, and you can see it's actually going up to 3. Because obviously, as I said, because it's going to be looking at this and saying, is it above 0? And we've already changed it and turned it off, they won't be above 0. And then so the other loop won't be captured. It's a very confusing thing when you start dealing with loops, but you just have to be aware of it, that you can have loops going, so you do need to make extra checks. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. I know it's a big waffle. It's a hard one to explain. One's calling the other, and it's all off timed. So you just have to be a little bit careful. But overall, this is the only bit we have to worry about. It's just a simple little bit of code here, which is saying, yeah, we're going to turn it off, and we're going to turn all of them off, and we're going to make sure that one's turned on. And that's it. And that's how I do my radio buttons. And there's not much else, as I say, within here, what you really need to do. Obviously, the global page is your track. And going forward, just for reference, I'm trying to come up with a codec file, which is going to be quite global. So it would work across, the structure would be there to work across multiple MIDI controllers. And all you would need to do would be literally to come into here, say, and just change up your CC numbers. Hey, what is the CC number my buttons are sending out? Or what CC numbers my knob doing? What note number is my button sending out? So my Akai, it's all notes it's sending out. So I need to track that. And so you just, hopefully I'm just going to have this one little table where you're going to come in and say that. And I might have some roles where you're going to say, well, actually, this is a transport. So when I hit this particular button, I want to push start, stop, rewind, and just have it just in this one section. And then I'm going to have loads of code, and then hopefully have very, very similar functionality like I've done on my Akai. So everyone can have that functionality just by changing a few items. And then if we get the community going, obviously, if you've made a change and it's working on your controller, you can let me have it back. And then someone else can say, oh yeah, that's my controller. I can just download that particular one, and off we go. Key thing being, as I say, trying to keep the codec file nice and global apart from this one section, which will be flexible. But then it means that we can actually have one mapping file. Again, I understand that most people, like most controllers I have, only have 8 buttons, but then I've got that tablet where I can actually build loads and loads and loads of buttons, like 40 buttons. So the mapping file will be more specific for that tablet. But we should be able to have a good standardized file to work from, a default remote map to work from. So that's my overall goal, is to try and come up with something a bit more global for absolutely everybody. Right, I really have waffled enough. This leaves me to saying thank you for watching, and bye for now.